Immolation. His head itched. He scratched it and went on walking. It was cold. The temperature had dropped to -2 Celsius 3 days before. It hadn't changed since then. The freezing rain came and went. Twilight had lasted more than 72 hours. Telek couldn't remember. He walked on. He walked on grainy ice. His boots crunched the little pellets as he went on. The sound somehow reassured him. Sometimes the rhythm told him of things past. Childhood train rides back in Chile, or something more recent, such as the sound of his keyboard at home in he couldn't remember. The path did its usual thing: twist, turn, go up, go down. The forest surrounded him. The wind blew a little bit harder, and he heard the mighty trees' trunks creak. Foliage whispered overhead. He stopped and looked up. He could barely see the canopy. The leaden sky peeked momentarily through the trees as they swayed. His head itched. It was the right side. He scratched it again. He felt something wet on his fingers. He looked at them. They were sticky. He could not make out colors very well in the twilight. He touched his head more carefully and noticed that his hair was getting wet too. He smelled his fingers. It was useless. Nothing smelled in the forest. He knew that. He walked on. Suddenly, the temperature and the light began to increase. Telek slowed down. 15 minutes later, sunlight streaked through the trees. A warm breeze ruffled the lower underbrush. He got the M16 off his shoulder and slowed down. This was not good. That the path should ease up almost invariably led to violence. It got worse really fast. Telek saw the clearing at the last minute. Telek hated clearings. They were like Roman arenas where very unpleasant stuff happened. He hesitated before entering. Then he remembered there was nothing else he could do. He walked in and he saw the boy almost immediately. He was sitting on a red and black patterned picnic blanket. He was eating a ham and cheese sandwich and drinking milk. Telek could barely believe what he was seeing. Nobody was supposed to eat and drink in the forest. Maybe things are changing, he thought. He approached. The boy saw him. He stopped eating. He put the sandwich down on a paper plate by his side. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin. The napkin had a dancing bear pattern on it. The boy smiled widely at Telek. "Hi," he said. "My name is Molen. What's your name?" Telek did not smile back. "I'm Telek. What are you doing here?" "Eating my sandwich," he said, beaming as he picked it up. "Want to sit down and eat with me? I have another sandwich in the basket here. Want one? They're good." Telek didn't answer and looked around at the clearing. It was large enough that he would be able to see anything coming at him from the edge. "No thanks," he said, "but I'll sit with you for a while, if you don't mind." "Okay," said the boy. He had brown eyes and brown hair. He was about 12 years old. Telek sat down and looked for the path on the other side of the clearing. It took him a while, but eventually he saw the opening. The boy had begun to talk about astronomy. He said he knew where Sirius was and continued to rattle on constellation and star names: Mizar, Aldebaran, Canis Majoris, Ursa Majoris, Antares, Orion, Pollux, Castor. It got it all mixed up in Telek's mind, but the boy seemed content to chomp on his sandwich, swig on his milk, and prattle on his celestial talk. Telek found himself relaxing. Something told him that relaxing was not a good idea. He did it anyway. The kid shifted to botany and began to name flowers and trees and plants and shrubs. Telek found it pleasant to listen to him. The kid seemed to know what he was talking about. Telek's head itched. He scratched it. This time there was definitely blood on his fingers. Telek wiped his hands quickly on his pants to keep the boy from seeing it. The boy had finished his sandwich and milk and announced that he was going to take a nap. He produced a small pillow from inside his picnic basket. He lied down on his left side and fell promptly asleep. Telek lifted his hand to check his head again, but he didn't need to. He felt the blood rivulet on his neck. He touched his head anyway. He felt the slit on the side of his scalp running down from top to bottom behind his ear. He explored the slit with his fingers and noticed that the scalp tissue seemed to disintegrate under his touch. Without warning, fire ripped through his scalp. Telek moaned. Molen stirred. "Oh crap," mumbled Telek. He got up, picked up the rifle, and quietly headed for the path on the other side of the clearing. By the time he reached the trees, his head felt like a fishbowl, teeming with snake-like raw nerves, orchestrating symphonies of pain as they swayed around to the rhythm of his steps. Telek began to run. The symphonies quickened. He stopped. Telek could feel the temperature dropping. The wind began to moan. The sky turned dark. Lightning flashed above. Thunder rolled by. Telek began to moan, a counterpoint to the wind. He grabbed his head. His skull cracked open along the old wound. "He's Palia," he groaned as he fell to his knees holding his head. His hands were full of blood. It ran down his forearms to his elbows and then onto the ground, where it steamed shortly before freezing. He fell forward. He screamed long and hard. He began to shiver. He turned over writhing. He felt as if he had a red-hot steel cockroach burrowing inside his brain mass and laughing. Yes, the cockroach was laughing at him, and its long antennae were cutting through his brain like hot wires cutting through cheese. The cockroach laughed and sliced and burned through the brain mass. The cockroach chomped around and ate Telek's brain. Between wild fits of laughter, Telek screamed and screamed. The antenna reached the inner walls of his skull and sliced unobtrusively through the bone. Blood seeped out through thin fissures. Telek got up with his right hand on the side of his head and began to stumble forward, half blinded in the twilight. He walked straight into a tree. He hugged it and put his face to it as he shook. He was trying to take a step backward when his blood-covered eyes registered a blinding flash of lightning above. Time slowed down. The bolt of lightning hit the tree and ripped down through it as it sought the ground. Telek saw it coming down at him. He thought about getting away from the tree. It was too late. The massive bolt of energy reached him and flared into his flesh. Telek ignited like a match. He tried to scream. He inhaled fire. His scream turned into a hissing gurgle. He was thrown back from the tree. He fell to the ground engulfed in flames. He continued to scream inside his head as he burned alive. The cockroach stopped laughing as the brain boiled away. His Palia found him a week later. Telek was on his back. His arms were at his sides. His forearms were raised and his hands were made into fists. His mouth was open in the shape of a horrendous scream. He was breathing regularly. His head was still cracked open, and blood and cerebrospinal fluid had frozen into a mound beside his head. "There you go again, Telek," said Hispalia. She turned him on his left side and exposed his head injury. She inspected it from several angles. She put her fingers on the edges and then dipped them into the fluid that had pooled in the wound. She touched the brain and slowly sank her hand down to the wrist into Telek's head. She began to mumble and mutter incantations. Telek squirmed and moaned softly. Telek got up slowly and looked around him. Hispalia was gone. He touched the side of his head. It didn't itch anymore. It only felt a little bit tender. He traced the scar with his fingers as if to reassure himself that it was completely closed. The scar felt too soft. The bone had not fused under the skin. He felt his brain mass pulsate under the skin. He shivered. He got up, picked up the rifle, and started to walk east. The path wound its way in front of him. He could only see a short way ahead. The forest still surrounded him, cold, damp, misty in its eternal twilight. Telek walked on. 40 hours later, he noticed that the forest was thinning again. The temperature increased. Shortly afterwards, he saw the end of the path. It opened onto a slope slanting upwards. The sun shone onto a field of yellowed grass. Telek thought of wheat. He stopped. Then he simply walked out of the forest. He walked up to the slope until he reached the top.